The Connector Next Door is your invitation to meet the natural connectors all around us. They represent the everyday event planners who are energizing their communities every single day. Their stories are familiar, fun, and full of charm. Your host, Lisa Garrow, is a lifelong event planner and has been a connection strategy coach for over a decade. She knows events can become energized connecting points where communities can gather and grow. Let's listen in as she strikes up a conversation with today's Connector Next Door.
Dr. Victoria Burns is an associate professor at the University of Calgary. As a registered social worker, educator, researcher, and engaged activist, she has invested her energy and expertise in the homelessness and addiction recovery sphere for over 15 years. She comes to her work with lived experience of addiction, recovery, and disability. Even with all her accomplishments, accolades, and awards, I didn't know of Victoria and her brave story until last summer. Victoria was introduced to me by a mutual connection as the director of UCalgary Recovery Community, or UCRC, and Recovery on Campus, or ROC, Alberta. Together with her ROC team, which now includes me and my Candy team, Victoria is on a mission to co-create peer-driven campus communities that support and celebrate all pathways of recovery for students, faculty, and staff in Alberta and beyond. In our conversation today, Victoria shares how the research shows that providing fun, informative, recovery-friendly events on campus is one of the ways community is built. And we're already seeing the results. Well, welcome back, everyone, to the Connector Next Door. I get to have conversations with people that are natural connectors in their world. And today I have the amazing Dr. Victoria Burns with me today. I'm excited to have you here.
Thanks for inviting me, Lisa. Excited to be here.
We've been working together for a few months now. It was last summer. So as things were opening up, we were introduced, and I just fell in love with what you were working on and the projects that you've got going on. But before we get into all of that and who you are as a natural connector, I'd love to hear from you. What does connection mean to you in your world?
I'd have to say connection is at the root of everything. So having worked in addiction for years and experienced addiction and understanding addiction as a lack of connection, and having worked over the last 10 years to rebuild that in my own life, it's really my lifeline. But also, I think in terms of the work that I've been doing with the team for Recovery on Campus, it is, you cannot do any sort of community development work without connections. So I think it really is the source of wellness and also meaning. Not to get too philosophical right off the bat.
Well, and honestly, I think when people you live and breathe this, right? And so if people are saying, well, how does that help someone that is in addiction or is trying to find some sense of recovery in their lives, what does connection actually do for that person? When we do say that community connection is sort of where we find our grounding, where we learn more about ourselves. That's kind of my perspective. But for somebody that is actually going through recovery or in recovery, what does that actually look like for them? What's the value of that?
Well, the wise Johan Hari has a TED Talk, and he says the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it's connection. And that idea holds so much truth, I think, because when you're in the depths of addiction, as I was, it's an extremely isolating experience for many reasons, because the substance or behavior becomes your primary connection, essentially, in your life, the driver, and a lot of the other connections take second, kind of are secondary to that. And it just takes increasingly more room in your life. and the consequences become increasingly worse. So when there's this idea of, illness starts with I and wellness starts with we, and I do believe that, because recovery is so much more than changing your relationship with a substance or a behavior, and that could be moderating, that could be abstaining entirely. It's about rebuilding connections in your life. This could be, relationships. It's also work, it's education. It could be spiritual connection that's been broken, connection with the land, nature. A lot of that is what recovery is about. We call it recovery capital. So kind of like the idea of social capital, it's this idea of how do we, when we put down the substance, this was my experience, in many ways we get worse, not better, because the substance wasn't necessarily our problem. It was the solution to the lack of connections in life, right? The trauma separates us from others. And shame is extremely, the second cousin of trauma is shame. So it's how do you rebuild that? And that's where the Recovery on Campus program comes in, because it's working towards building that recovery capital by way of connections. And that's where, having substance-free events, having an award program, celebrating this identity that was very stigmatized, is part of that rebuilding and connecting on campus for a marginalized group.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit about your story and kind of what led you there to feeling connected.
Sure. So my drug of choice was alcohol, and I experimented in my youth, but really, I would say started drinking in earnest at age 18. And it was I think the glue, kind of the currency for connection, if we're going to go that way, was alcohol, because it was a very powerful currency for connection. I grew up in a home where there was a lot of untreated addiction and mental illness, and felt a little bit excluded, and always had that feeling inside like that I didn't really fit in. So I had a lot of anxiety from a very early age. And then when I drank, it was like the anxiety, just like the pressure cooker kind of went off, and I could become someone else. And I was invited to parties, and I started drinking. I was on an exchange to France when I was 18, and for a year. And that's where it was just so normalized as well. And it was kind of presented as a positive, like romanticized kind of idea, this idea of drinking. And the negative stuff wasn't really ever discussed, even though I had a lot of addiction, alcohol addiction specifically in my home life. I thought I was different, right? I didn't think that it would happen to me like it did to my uncles and my dad and everything. So I continued on as a student for many years. I went through and did 2 bachelor degrees, a master's, a PhD. And it was during my PhD where I actually hit my bottom, one of my many bottoms, but my last bottom, and entered a recovery. And I had tried controlling my drinking for about those 15 years and failed, because I had, that, whatever you want to call it, I had a gene, I had the genetic predisposition, I had the trauma, I had the environmental, because it's not just one thing that causes addiction. It's really, this culmination of factors. And I think a large factor was the environment. And the environment I was in was academia or university culture, where binge drinking was not only normalized, but celebrated, and blacking out was not seen as abnormal. It was seen as comical. So that was the culture that I was seeped in. And I thought that if I stopped drinking, I would lose all my connections. I would lose this identity I had built as being this fun-loving person who was the life of the party, who stayed the longest, who could drink the boys under the table, all of these badge of honor, and was like I had grown up the kind of quote unquote good girl, but I felt like it sort of gave me this like rebellious edge or something. And I would lose that. So it wasn't just a matter of like a drink. It was really embedded, like my identity was embedded in it. And stopping felt like death. Like it wasn't even on the table because I just needed to figure out how to drink quote unquote normally and not have the negative consequences, but still have that positive effect. Because it did have a very positive effect for several years. And then it progressively got worse and the consequences got worse. And then what's interesting is this with addiction, it's sort of like we build a community or people who drink or whatever substance, and then you become isolated. It's like it turns at one point, it's not like a day it turns on you, but it does start to turn, and then your relationships start to suffer because of the substance. And my relationship started to suffer, and I didn't know what to do. And I went to multiple therapists, and I was against 12-step programs. I thought that AA was a cult. I didn't want anything to do with God or higher power or anything. And I had reached out for help many times. And before, so I did end up starting my recovery journey through AA, which is a 12-step program, because it was I was desperate. And it was the only thing available to me, that I could afford. It's free. I had no money. I was a student. And also it's community based, it's peer, it's a mutual help. And when I met people who were in the program who were like me and saying, I drank like you too, because I thought I was just, this really, an anomaly, like no one would get it. And then I would hear these stories, and it was really through storytelling that I learned that I wasn't alone, and we could even, there was some levity about, what had happened. And it was really that community focus and peer support that I needed, because I had tried individual therapy, trying to get kind of to the root of my addiction. And I think that it's not to say talk therapy and trauma therapy aren't important, but I really did need that community of people who normalized how I was feeling. And the therapist just kind of, as much training or knowledge, unless you've really lived it, there was still some shame. So I think that by being part of a group where you can normalize the experience, it really helped dissolve a lot of the shame that I had been experiencing. And that was really integral to my healing.
And it's incredible when you talk about the feeling of connection, that you weren't necessarily where you are now. Like you've made the shift in your life, but at the time, it was in the middle of it that you actually felt community. It was in the middle of it that you actually felt connection, because you were hearing the stories. And that's something that is always really intriguing to me, is that we don't have to arrive somewhere to feel like we've actually created or are feeling the sense of connection with someone else or with a group. But it's taking the first step. It's getting in the door. It's having a conversation, or even being willing to share our own story, which is something that you talk about a lot with Recovery on Campus, is recovering out loud. So when we talk about recovering out loud, how does that tie into what your story was and what you want people to be able to share? What kind of community do you want them to experience now through ROC, where they might, even if it's a first touch, or they're just going to one event, or they're meeting up with one of the staff, what is it that you want them to leave with?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when I got sober in 2013, I was 2 years into my PhD, and I was living in Montreal, going to McGill University. And I had never learned about recovery. And this was, having been in the helping profession for over a decade and studying social work and psychology. And it was actually through a colleague and friend at McGill who I met, named Ben, who I found out he was 25 years into recovery and was the life of the party. And he planted the seed for me. It was actually at a party where I was drinking and he wasn't, and I couldn't understand why. And he disclosed to me, he quote unquote recovered out loud to me in a private moment that he was in recovery. And it just blew my mind because I had never met anyone in recovery who used that language. The only thing I knew about recovery was what I saw on TV and, kind of dingy church basements, bad coffee, uncomfortable chairs, old men. and I didn't want any part of that. And he just said it very nonchalantly and was we call it, in the research, we talk about the warm handoff. He really inspired me to try to reach out to the 12-step community, but also, not that was the only pathway, right? It was that he framed recovery as actually a better life than I was having. Because I thought my life would be over if I stopped drinking, because drinking had taken up so much space and I would lose my drinking relationships, which weren't actually really quality relationships, I realize now in hindsight. So this reframing or restoring of being alcohol free and having more fun was really important to me, because I didn't think that would be possible, but he embodied that and gave me hope, is what I now realize. So when I created Recovery on Campus, it was to provide more built-in opportunities for those Ben moments where you can say, yeah, I get it. Me too. I'm in recovery and I'm thriving and I'm doing a PhD at McGill University and I'm in recovery and I'm doing all these other things. It's not my only identity. It's part of it. And this identity allows me to show up in my life in an honest, present way, which, when you're in active addiction, you just can't. Mm-hmm. And so that was really a turning point for me. And Recovery on Campus, I promote recovering out loud at various levels. It doesn't have to be publicly. It can be in a private moment, but I think that Me Too experience is so powerful and we need it. And we need more built-in opportunities on campus specifically, because people are there for several years and it is a very recovery threatening environment.
Mm. And it's interesting because I use the term for events, connection points. When I use the phrase connection points, when I talk about events, it sounds a little bit like what you're talking about here, where there's some kind of a built-in opportunity for people to experience what you're saying and it doesn't have to be at a loudspeaker in a mic. Yeah. It can be one-on-one with somebody by the table where you're actually having a conversation around where you're at and what's important to you. But what a beautiful thing for him to share, that you could have an even richer, deeper life. And many of us get in that zone where it's like, this is what my life is about. This is how I experience life. This is how I get through life. And we manage, right? Like it's something that we learn how to manage. And I think from your story, you were managing, you were excelling in school and you were making connections. But to really put yourself in that shift where you're saying, maybe it's possible. Maybe there's something else for me here. I know events are a big part of what ROC is, but can you explain a little bit for those that don't know what ROC is? Where did that then come to be, where you wanted to formalize a program on campus like ROC?
So ROC stands for Recovery on Campus, Alberta, and it's actually an outgrowth of the University of Calgary recovery community, which is a collegiate recovery program. And I'll get into that in a second. But basically, I moved to Calgary with my husband and dog Pino. Pino, like the wine, who was named before I got sober. He's going to be 12 and I'm turning 10 in November. So so we moved to Calgary and I was very much in the quote unquote recovery closet, because I was advised by senior academics and also professionals in my recovery community not to tell anyone because of the stigma, I would be judged, I would lose job opportunities. And I didn't want to do anything that would compromise me getting a job. I was looking for a tenure track job. I had just finished I was doing a postdoc, and so it became increasingly unmanageable to lead this double life in recovery as a social work professor, as a person, who was working in the field of addiction and harm reduction as well. It was becoming very difficult and stressful, and ultimately threatening my own recovery, the duplicity of it, the cognitive dissonance. So I ended up getting to the point where I was prepared to leave my tenure track job because it was killing me. And I met with my dean, and he was very supportive of me recovering out loud, when teachable moments came up and all of this kind of thing. And that led me on a journey of starting to do some research in this area of reducing stigma, addiction and recovery stigma on campus for faculty, creating a recovery-friendly workplace. And then that led to discovering collegiate recovery programs, which started in the 1970s in the United States. The first was in 1977 at Brown University, started by a professor in recovery who created a position, Associate Dean of Recovery, and helped students recover because they were coming to him and there was no structures in place to support them. So the best practices of collegiate recovery include paid dedicated staff, a physical space, awards, so scholarships for students in recovery, also social events, so substance-free social events. And that's where, Lisa, you have come in and been very instrumental in the work that we're doing. Also recovery housing or substance-free housing for residents, and recovery programming. So, it could be one-on-one support. Peer support is also a pillar. So mutual help meetings. Doesn't have to be AA now. There's so many mutual help. There's smart recovery, refuge recovery, you name it. There's a group for it. And we host a recovery for all people, all pathways meetings for faculty, staff, one for students and one for family members and friends. And the social events are really important, I think, in terms of celebrating, normalizing recovery. Again, like Ben, promoting that idea that there's another way. So for those who can't use substances in safety, which was the case for me, and I tried, trust me, I think having alternatives, because especially around alcohol, because it is the most common drug and often not even seen as a drug. We often will say drugs or alcohol, but alcohol is very much a very dangerous drug. There's events where that is the central theme. And for those of us who don't want to engage, or maybe are trying to cut back or moderate, it can be very threatening to our wellness. And that's where having some substance-free events. So we have, for instance, a sober or alcohol-free St. Patrick's Day coming up that you've helped us with. And also, mocktails we did at our retreat, and we're doing a lunch and unlearn for staff around, busting myths about alcohol. There's been lots of different events. And so basically, kind of just to bring it back, so the UCRC was started. I started doing research in this area in 2018, and then started to try to create a program 2020, 2021, kind of pounding the pavement, knocking on doors, looking for funders so that we could find hire a coordinator. And then that came through a City of Calgary grant in 2021. So it'll be 2 years in May. We found out that summer, and that allowed us to hire a coordinator. And after that, so we kept, we created our peer support meetings. We started doing substance-free events, work towards recovery housing or substance-free residence housing, which we now have. And we only had 6-month pilot money. So after the 6-month pilot, again, we were looking for funding to continue our programming, and were approached by Alberta Health, who recognize post-secondary as a gap in the recovery-oriented system of care. And we put together a proposal basically to create collegiate recovery programs across the province, to create them in the 26 publicly funded post-secondaries. So that was a year of funding that started last summer. So we're kind of coming up on our year anniversary. We did get a year extension, and we've been working with the 26, and that's where you, Elisa, you come in to help us create events. We have seed grants to go to the 26 to create events. So our mission for ROC is to engage, innovate, and create collegiate recovery programs across the province and beyond. Because we say and beyond because this was something that, I went to school in New Brunswick and Montreal and never heard about collegiate recovery. And I think it would have helped me and others, I know so much, to have this community on campus, that, we need to recognize that people who struggle with addiction or in recovery are a marginalized group, and we need to include them in strategic programming and supports.
Obviously, this is a passion for you. This is something that is a passion, but goes way beyond just having the sense that this changed your life. And that's why I love being involved with the team, because I have for years and years tried to find alternatives or encouraged some of our clients to really look at how could this be more inclusive? How could this event include, okay, maybe we're going to have the bar, get everything that is typically expected. But I made a choice years ago, and not many people know sort of my upbringing. I was in a community where there was a lot of abuse of alcohol, and I was working with a lot of children that, just as the fallout happens, they had to deal with being in a family or in a home where there was either people in recovery or there was some abuse of substances as well. And I just made a decision early on that I wouldn't drink. But as I got into my career as an event coach now, and really building out events that people expect, but when I think of recovering out loud, honestly feel many of us that are out there planning and promoting our own events, we have the ability to say, what if we introduce some kind of alternative? Back in the day, there was no mocktails, now non-alcoholic drink. I appreciate what you're saying. It wasn't cool. If the joke was always like, Lisa's going to have a ginger ale, but they'll put it in a wine glass. Now it's much more accepted at an event. But what a beautiful opportunity we have as we're designing events on campus that are friendly to people in recovery, but also for people that are just making a life choice around how they participate in an event. I love where the team has taken this over the last year. It's been really exciting to see the applications come in for that seed funding for those events. A whole lot of amazing creative ways to participate without the alcohol. And I think that's part of shifting how people think about events.
I've seen the applications come in, and even today I was looking at the social media, and Red Deer Polytechnic has this. It was so clever. It was Shamrock Shenanigans Unleaded. They're doing a St. Patrick's Day alternative event. That is so creative, and they made it so fun. So when I see those, my heart just feels full, because without ROC, they wouldn't. These are the seeds that are planting, right? It's seed money, so we don't know what the impact is going to be. Maybe it is someone who, like me, thought, was not drinking equal boring and not cool, right? Mm-hmm. And then you have that connection, maybe one-on-one with someone who says, I like to be present. I think that's what one of the biggest gifts of recovery for me is at events. The centerpiece was not necessarily the people, it was the alcohol. It was getting more, am I going to have enough? Am I going to have too much? Like, it takes up a lot of space. And then you don't actually have as much mental space or attention for the people. And you have conversations that you may not even remember. So, it's not about prohibition or anything. And it's not to judge people who can drink alcohol in safety, because there are many people. But I think a lot of people can't, and a lot of people maybe just don't drink for other reasons, like you were saying, it was a choice. And I think that this is an inclusive, these inclusive events are going to piece by piece start to change the culture, because it's, the culture changes by attitude changes. And attitude changes often, it's about, there's that saying, like, you can't think your way into a new way of acting, but you can act your way into a new way of thinking. Right. And I think by behaviors, going to these kind of events, it starts to change your attitude.
Totally. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. It's really just such an honor to be part of the team and to be included, and especially to do something that I already love. It's the work that I do as a connection strategy coach, event coach. If somebody's really excited about moving forward, or even seeing what this might look like on their campus, whether you're a student, faculty, staff that is planning or promoting your own events, there is an opportunity here to rethink how that can happen. And the ROC team really has now come to a place where the resources are there, the information is there, there's going to be a toolkit there, there's all sorts of supports that are available. So Victoria, maybe if you want to leave us with how could they be involved with ROC? What does that look like if they want to reach out to the ROC team?
We have a website. We have an Instagram page. Chelsea, our amazing coordinator, has an email, and we can also put that out. And also people can reach out to me directly. My profile is on the Calgary Faculty of Social Work website and also on Recovery on Campus. If people have any questions, I'm always happy to talk about recovery. And we have a wonderful team who are passionate and wanting to help create collegiate recovery programs across the province. So I know, Lisa, so grateful to have you as part of the team, and you have helped us so much get our events going, and to see events in a different way, I think, as these opportunities for connection. And we just hope that the 26, the goal is to create and sustain collegiate recovery programs, and we're here to help support that in any way that we can. So reach out and follow us on Instagram, and we look forward to hearing from you.
And as you are reaching out, also when you're looking at the socials for ROC, I'll put all of those links in the description below here. But I wanted to make sure that as you are exploring what your events can look like, we will be posting some of those events that are coming up. So it'll be that inspiration, like unleaded, like how cool and amazing is that? And we've been already having so many amazing coaching conversations around how to creatively just stand out and make it something that anyone would want to attend. So it's super exciting to see where we're going as a team. Thank you again, Victoria, for being here. It's just always such a joy to talk to you, and I am honored to call you a friend. And I know that there will be more of these conversations to come, but thanks so much for being here with me today.
Thank you, Lisa. Big hugs.
The Connector Next Door podcast is produced by Candy Event Consulting, where everyday event planners and their teams gain clarity, get connected, and grow in confidence. Subscribe at www.candyconsulting.ca to hear visits with everyday event planners who are putting connections first.